Written in 1609, the very same year Galileo had trained his telescope on Jupiter, the king of the planets, and discovered its 4 largest moons, the venerable bard and playwright William Shakespeare wrote perhaps the most iconic drama in all of Western literature, Hamlet. The central character, Prince Hamlet of Denmark, has seen the spirit of his deceased father. The infamous ghost of Denmark eventually tells his son he has been murdered by his brother Claudius and desires his son to enact vengeance on his behalf. This central theme leads the readers through a labyrinth of some of the most remarkably timeless and enigmatic introspection ever written for stage or screen. Is it better to live or to die? And when we die, what next? As Hamlet ponders, quote, "To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep, to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation, devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause." End quote. In the 21st century, where it has become increasingly normative to reject any idea of the supernatural, including God and the afterlife, Hamlet's questions remain as poignant and relevant as ever, despite the rampant materialistic assumptions of modern science. The philosophy of materialism can be traced back to the early to mid-1800s, when a group of philosophers and thinkers attempted to create a theory of the physical world that would, quote, "sap the supernatural sanctions of Christianity," end quote. The end result of the materialists' assumptions were an acerbic reductionism of physical causation where, quote, "all forces, whether in organic or inorganic nature, are in the final analysis nothing other than motive forces determined by the interaction of material atoms," end quote. There has been of recent, however, a new field of study focused on near-death experiences, or NDEs. The science of NDEs has challenged this reductionism. How can consciousness exist or continue to exist in a person whose heart has flatlined and whose brain shows no signs of any activity? According to different studies, as many as 1 in 10 people have reported having an NDE, and the experiences range from an out-of-body perception to seeing deceased relatives or lights at the end of a tunnel. Some report details of which they could not possibly have been cognizant of while lying clinically dead on an operating table. And it is difficult for researchers to offer a completely materialistic explanation for such experiences. We talk with New Testament scholar Dr. Gary Habermas and how he sees his research on the resurrection of Jesus dovetailing into the field of near-death experiences.
Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of both skeptics and believers respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. I'm going to introduce our special guest, author and special guest in here just a little bit. I also wanted to give you a little background on myself. I'm James Walker. I'm the president of Watchman Fellowship, a Christian apologetics ministry focusing on mostly interfaith evangelism and discernment issues. I'm the Christian part of the Christian Atheist and Christian Book Club. Our other co-founder is also with us, Bill Cluck. Bill Cluck is a former Christian, now atheist. He was talking about wanting to do something so that we can have some more dialogue, some more communication. This goes back, 3.5 years ago, I guess, at least. And so we decided let's form a book club where we can talk about important books from both perspectives. So what we do typically is we'll alternate. We do a Christian book one month and then an atheist book the next month. And we've got usually this is the first time we haven't had an in-person meeting. Usually we meet at our Watchman offices in Arlington, Texas, and we'll have anywhere between 20 and 40, about half and half believers and half skeptics or atheists. And what makes it unique is we try to be respectful. We want to be outside of our own echo chambers, so we hear new ideas. And what we value is steel manning rather than straw manning. In other words, we want to hear what the person has to say, listen to them, whichever side we're on, and then be able to understand the questions that they're asking. And I know it's been very, very helpful for me personally. I think it helps me be a better thinker. Hopefully it does. And also give me some really good friends. So our motto is that we're a friendly group, but we're not really friendly, just friendly. We are friends at this point. And so because of COVID, we finally broke down and said we've gone way too long without a club, so we're going to do a virtual one. We're going to do Zoom. I have a little trepidation about this because what it means is a lot of people that's never been to the club are coming in, and how are you supposed to act? How are we supposed to dialogue? So I hope that you see this as something that we want to be respectful, but we don't want to shy away from tough questions. And as long as they're given in a respectful way, whichever side it's coming from, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a Christian, ask tough questions, drill down, but do so with mutual respect, and it'll be greatly, greatly appreciated. So let me see here. Let me introduce our guest this time. We usually try to have the author of whatever book we're dealing with, either in person, which we've had a lot lately, actually have the author with us in person, or to bring them in by Skype or Zoom or something so that we can at least interact with the author of the work that we're looking at. And we're privileged to have Dr. Gary Habermas with us. We're not doing one of his books this time. We were looking simply at an interview that he did on near-death experiences. But let me introduce you to Dr. Habermas. And if you could unmute your mic so you can say a few words once I get your introduction. Dr. Gary Habermas has his PhD from Michigan State University, and he currently teaches at Liberty University as Distinguished Research Professor, Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary and Graduate School. He's the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Liberty University, currently teaching in the PhD seminary program. He's written, co-authored, and edited over 40 books. He's considered a leading evangelical authority on the resurrection of Jesus. Particularly, he helped to pioneer the minimal facts approach to having discussions and conversations on the resurrection of Jesus, which I really have told Gary we really want to do a book club on that sometime. But right now, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with another very interesting topic. Gary's done a lot of research in this emerging field of near-death experiences, or NDE. Hopefully, a lot of you got to watch the interview that Daniel Ray and I did with Gary in New Orleans at the Defend Conference back in January of this year. And if you got to watch that, you kind of see what this topic is all about. So, Gary, let me just say welcome.
Well, James, we've talked about this for a long time over the recent months and even years, and it's glad to finally be with you. I've heard about your group. I love ideas like this, and I think what you're doing sounds wonderful.
Well, Gary, as I shared with you before, part of what we do, you were kind of a inspiration to us on that, because when we did we did Anthony Flou's book, There Is a God. He was, of course, one of the 20th century's most prolific atheist philosophers and thinkers, and he did a number of debates with you. Well, come to find out that after the debates, you guys go out to eat, and friendship developed, and you call back and forth across the ocean regularly with each other, and just out of this friendship and questions started developing. Eventually, Anthony Flue changed his position and became a deist, believing that there is a God, wrote a book about that. We did that book. And you were kind enough to come into our book club and talk about some of those conversations. So the kind of friendship you built with Tony Flue is the kind of thing that I want to have with my atheist friends. And I'm sure that many of my atheist friends want to have that kind of a relationship with me. So you're kind of our role model on that. So welcome to the book club, and I'm excited to get started with some questions in just a moment. Before we do, though, I did want to take a moment to, just a quick moment to talk about what we already have on the calendar. You guys are going to be very, very excited about this. Like I said, we usually alternate. We do a Christian book one month, an atheist book next month. So that means November is going to be Atheist Book Month. And we've just been able to secure a special speaker, Seth Andrews. Seth Andrews is he's the head of the Thinking Atheist. You guys may know it's both a podcast and really kind of an online community, I believe. He's written, he was a former Christian. He is, in 2004, he saw a video of Christopher Hitchens debating Rabbi Shumley Botek, which made him decide to leave his faith. And so he left Christianity in 2004. In 2008, he finally broke down and told his family and friends that he was an atheist, developed this new Thinking Atheist community and podcast. He's written a number of books. He's written the book Deconverted. He's also written Sacred Cows. But what we're going to do with the November, if you don't get the book, you need to go get the book now, start reading it so you'll be ready in November. He's going to be he's going to be talking about his new book, just came out earlier this year, Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian. Now, some of you may not know what a Fox News Christian is. It's a special kind, like its own denomination of Christian, a Fox News style Christian. But he is going to talk about the intersection of faith and politics. And I told him that, yeah, that's definitely something that's open for discussion. That's going to come up November 5th. And politics will probably be a lot in the news still on November 5th, so maybe that's a good time to talk about the intersection of religion and politics. But Seth Andrews, and so he's a special guest, and I'm excited to have him. This is going to be another Zoom meeting. And then in December, we go back to Christian again, and we're going to have Frank Turek. Frank Turek is the co-author of the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This was the meeting. Frank was supposed to be here with us in person at the book club back in March of this year. But with the pandemic, that got canceled. Everything got canceled. And so we're finally coming around to having that meeting that we've been looking forward to a long time now. And we're going to only, because that book is huge, we're going to focus mainly on one chapter. Anything in the book is going to be fair game. We're focusing mostly on one particular chapter of his book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Well-known apologist, and he co-authored the book with, who was that? Norm Geisler. And so I think there's a great couple of meetings that we're going to have. I'm excited to look about that, to look at that. I'm excited right now to say we have 60 people in the room with us right now, which is more than we've ever had at any of our in-person book clubs. So welcome, everyone. And I want to take this time now to just go back to Gary. Gary, some of the people weren't able to have time to actually watch that 50-minute interview that Daniel Ray and I did with you back in December, where we kind of talked about what an NDE is. What is that? Could you go back over that ground just very briefly and tell us, okay, what is a near-death experience? How do we define that? And what does that have to do, how does that intersect with the whole idea of atheism and Christianity and religion in general?
Okay, well, on the definition of NDE, let me say right up front that NDEs do not only occur, or maybe I should say it the other way around, they don't always happen in the presence of some serious medical condition, but that is the majority of the data, and that's the best known cases. Now, in the early literature, which we're going back to late 70s, early 80s, when the gurus of NDE work first started writing, and they were probably as cosmopolitan a group as you've got here at the club meeting tonight. They had a lot of different views, a lot of different angles, and they defined a near-death experience as an experience that is frequently had at the time of near death, and here's the definition of that. Near death is a state with a diminishing number of medical signs from which a person can reasonably be said to be on the track to die without intervention. And so near death does not mean you're dead, but many of these cases, well, let's put it this way. They fit some of the definitions of death for short periods of time. And I say short periods of time. I don't mean, well, I mean, 5 minutes would qualify, 20 minutes would qualify. But some of these cases last for a few hours. They're very, very interesting. And these have been documented medically. In fact, the medical community has gotten into these experiences very much. In fact, back in 1982, being very interested in this and having done a lot of work at that time on the resurrection, I flew up to University of Connecticut, where I joined a growing group of today very well-known NDE researchers like Raymond Moody, Ken Ring, Bruce Grayson, folks like that. Bruce Grayson could very well be the leading near-death authority in the world. And just to give you an example of how this has taken on a scientific atmosphere, Bruce just retired very few years ago from University of Virginia Medical School, where he was, I hope I'm getting his credentials right, he was an MD, and he was a distinguished professor of psychiatry and brain science. He was a director of the Brain Sciences Institute, and he has published over 100 peer review articles in medical and psychological journals. Now, he's done way more than 100, but 100 in just medical and scientific, medical and he's done a lot. He's done a lot both ways, pro and con, arguments for, arguments against. So that's kind of a quick definition: a state from which a person can reasonably be said to die without intervention, and they often report data. In a recent book, I just happen to have this sitting here because I use it in research. I'm holding this up right here. The Science of Near-Death Experiences, published not by some Christian press, but by University of Missouri Press. The author is a medical doctor, and I believe every article in this book has been taken from a medical journal. And they estimate, just to get the conversation going, they estimate that in North America alone, if their statistics hold true, in North America alone, they estimate that between 9 and 20 million people have claimed to have experienced something which may be called near-death phenomena. So just as a joke, you know, when someone says, well, oh, you Christians believe in Narnia. Oh, you Christians believe in Middle Earth. I've never been there. I don't think anybody's been there. Well, when you start talking about near-death experiences, according to this book, there's millions of people who claim to have had these. Now, does that make them true? No. Does that mean they're all evidenced? No, most of them are not evidenced. But there are people who claim that they were in another world. We can talk about that later, because the definition of this other world, quote unquote, is really interesting. But that just gets us started. That's an open kind of grounds on which this happened. And a lot of the American public, according to polls, is interested in whether there's an afterlife. The numbers have been going up, probably largely because of these experiences. But they don't just attract Christians and non-Christians. They attract all kinds of religious persuasions. And there's all kinds of people of other religious views that favor and write about and sometimes critique near-death experiences. So,
you've never met Gary. You've never met our co-founder, I don't think. Bill Cluck is the atheist component of our Atheist and Christian Book Club, and Bill has watched the interview, had some questions, insights about it. Bill, did you have something, an insight or a question you want to ask?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, James and Gary, for resurrecting the club from the dead. I mean, this has been great.
It's live. It's alive.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Habermas. It's a real honor to have you at the club. Thank you very much for joining us.
No, thank you for the invite.
So years ago, I saw a fellow who died supposedly, and he experienced hell and the terrors and awful things about hell. Have you had any of those experiences?
Well, I've not been there before, But I have interviewed a number of people. Yes, I can tell you, according to the literature. In fact, there are key articles in books like this one and ones like them, where they have a category they don't want to say all about hellish near-death experiences. So they call them distressing near-death experiences. and there's another reason for that. Distressing comes in according to a lot of definitions. It could be a person who comes out in a traditional lake of fire, like in the book of Revelation, and they claim, yeah, I was there and there were demons. One case, there were demons and they were whipping us with whips while we were carrying meaningless, weights around. But then there's other kinds of distressing NDEs that don't fit the classical hell model. And these would be people who are abandoned in a place of darkness and increasing anxiety and depression. I would liken it to some of C.S. Lewis's ideas on hell in The Great Divorce. And then there's a very famous near-death experience had by a former very militant atheist who had a near-death experience, and he was tracked by something that I could playfully call zombies. And they chased him. This is before The Walking Dead, too, a long time ago. And he was so energized and converted that he was a professor at Northern Kentucky University. And by the way, this case was introduced to me by one of the best-known agnostic skeptics in this country, who sent me this man's tapes. And he was chased by these things and became a Christian in the NDE, during the NDE. He subsequently came out, said he had a posh job at the university, went back to seminary, got a seminary degree, pastored ever since, and I understand he just retired recently. In fact, a couple major motion picture studios have combined to do a set of interviews on NDEs. They just came to my house. I think I was the first interview about a month ago, but they were also going up to interview him because of his experience of hell. Now, to answer your question more directly, about 19 to 21%, so let's say about 20% of near-death experiences are the reports are of the distressing variety. So, yeah, the answer would be yes. And just so everybody knows, we're talking about testimonies here, not necessarily true or false data.
Oh, thanks. I really want to know my future, so that's very encouraging. One other quick question.
Sure.
Do you know, obviously the Buddhists would have well, not the Buddhists, but the Hindus would have a Hindu hell. Maybe the Muslims would have a Muslim hell where your skin is burned off just to be burned again. And who knows about the atheist hell, what that's going to be like. So probably just dealing with other atheists. I don't know. So what do you think of that? Does that marginalize or defeat the credibility if you have other types of religions experiencing their particular heaven or whatever?
Yeah, you may see me looking up and looking around my study here, because I often look over on the shelf where the very book is that I want to mention. And years ago, a book was written by a German psychologist and an Icelandic from Reykjavik, Icelandic psychologist, and they wrote a book called At the Hour of Death. And they were about 1,000. Now, these should be distinguished from near-death experiences, but these are pre-death visions. There are pre-death visions, things that people claim to see before they're actually taken. Post-death visions, where people, these are very famous today. John Dominic Crossan, the New Testament skeptic, is famous for introducing these. These are experiences that happen to a fair number of people where after the death of a loved one, usually a husband or a wife, I'll give you a real case. This is a real case of one of my PhD students' mothers. And his father, if I remember the story, was a Baptist minister. His mom died. They buried her that day. And Dad's home, and he's in his bedroom, and he's very forlorn. He's very sad. They've been married for, probably 50 years, and he's without his wife for the first time. And he looks down at the bottom of the bed because a motion kind of gets his attention, and his wife's standing there, or who he thought was his wife. And oftentimes in these experiences, they'll say something like, I can't stay. I've just got to tell you one thing. I'm doing fine. Don't worry about me. And amid the person's, please don't go, they're gone. Well, this student doing his PhD, he already had one doctor's degree, and he was doing a second doctor's degree with us, and he told this story to the class. And I asked him, I said, tell me something. Your dad and his theological training, he's not been told that if mom precedes you in death, she could be standing at the foot of your bed. And he said, no. And I said, there's no evidence there that she was really there. No. But I'll bet your dad thinks she was really there. Yes. I said, well, let me ask you something. Could somebody talk your dad out of this experience? No evidence. Could somebody talk your dad out of this experience? And he just smiled like, man, you got to know my dad. No way. My mom was there as far as my dad's concerned. Okay. This book, At the Hour of Death, has pre and post visions. And interestingly, to get right to your question, about 600 of them were from India. And by far the majority of the people in the study, the Indian folks from India, were Hindus. And so that's a real cross-religious spectrum with like 400 Western Europeans, Americans, and 600 Indian cases. There have been studies now on Buddhism, studies in Islam, studies in just about any religion you can think of. And I think I would often introduce a comment like this. A lot of times on these subjects, the Buddhist can stand shoulder to shoulder with a Hindu, can stand shoulder to shoulder with a Muslim, can stand shoulder to shoulder with a Jew, can stand shoulder to shoulder with a Christian. Here's what they can't agree on: which religion is true, because NDEs don't really help us tell us which religion's true. Everybody has their own beliefs, but what about the evidence? But where they agree is they'll say naturalism is incorrect by virtue of these experiences. And if I often introduce this by saying, you go back to the famous essay of Bertrand Russell, probably the best known British atheist before Anthony Flew. He wrote the famous book, Why I'm Not a Christian. And he said atheism stands on two key beliefs. There is no God, there is no afterlife. And that's the way he defines it. And so these different religious groups would say, yeah, well, what do you guys do with these near-death experiences? But the Jewish guy could feel like he's blood brothers with the Muslim, blood brothers with the Christian, and they'll discuss later whose religion's true. But if there's an afterlife, they think they've got the first rung, maybe the second most important rung, first one being God's existence in this whole dialogue. But yes, there are very many intercultural reports.
Hey Gary, one of our longtime atheist members, former Christian also, Ken Daniels. Ken is one of our authors. We did his book on one of our clubs maybe about 2 years ago. He is a former Wycliffe missionary, now a non-believer. But he had a question or two. Are you unmuted, Ken? Can you come on?
Yeah, yes, I am.
Great.
Thanks, Dr. Habermas, for joining our humble little group. And it's a fascinating topic, and I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. The topic is very fascinating. I especially honed in on the discussion in the interview about the veridical observations that were made, like serial numbers at the top of a cabinet or on the top of an ambulance or on a quarter or what have you. And so I have three questions. They're all kind of related to that particular topic.
Sure.
I looked at briefly at the book that you referenced, The Self Does Not Die. And so that was fascinating to me. But what the questions that came to mind, I'll start with the first one here. Have there been any controlled studies or experiments that demonstrate the ability of someone with an NDE to provide details related to out-of-view items placed ahead of time in an operating room, ruling out any possibility of cheating or collusion? The only controlled study I've heard of is the AWARE project, which yielded no evidence for the ability of patients to call out details they could not have discerned by ordinary means. I don't know if you want to just take that question, and I'll have a couple follow-ups, or if I just want to list them all, give them all out, because they're all related.
That's up to James. However you want to do
it. Let's deal with it in pieces.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, the AWARE study is very interesting. What they do is there are many participating hospitals. I believe more than a couple dozen, and they have computers or something of that along that line up in the rafter somewhere, and they have rotating series of numbers that roll across the screen by chance, and I suppose how many numbers depends on the study and so on. And then there are other studies, these are from a long time ago before computers were able to do that, where people would have objects on a table down a hall, and there were people who, now these are different than near-death experiences, but are called out-of-body experiences, and people who claim to be able to leave their body. This also often has an occult kind of flavor to it, but they would claim to be, they were often mediums, and it's amazing because some of our major universities participated in this research, and they were asked to go down the hall and report what's on the table. And, on the table could be a rubber ducky, an oversized ballpoint pen, just goofy things that you put on the table. They come back. Another one did have a number up in the air. That number was properly seen and recorded. The people, by the way, were on cots, and they were hooked up to machines all night, so you could check all this. Now, in the AWARE projects, only 1 or 2 cases of sightings have been reported. Now, when you read the Self Does Not Die book, what they propose, one of the comebacks they say to this is, look, if I'm free platonically and the universe is at my fingertips and I feel like I'm just looking around, and I'm not going to be looking for numbers up on the rafters. That's just not what I'm going to report. You figure, well, sooner or later, somebody's going to report something. And sooner or later, people do. There is a case or two. But that number you referred to, number on top of a medical shelf, that number was a 12-digit number. And when the person came to immediately, the person said to the nurse, write this down. And she took out a sheet of paper and she said, I'm obsessive compulsive, and whenever I see a larger number, I memorize it. So here's a 12-digit number, write this down and put it away somewhere safe. She'd just come out of this thing. And so days later, they were moving this medical apparatus. I sent a guy up there, if I remember the story correctly, on a ladder to look down on top. He read the number off. The nurse, there were 2 nurses that heard her do this, and they got their little sheets out, and she hit the number exactly correct. So there are number stories, but on that flashing computer one, there's been 1 or 2 cases that they've reported, but not as, disappointing for most people who would like a whole lot of those being reported. What often has to suffice are different kinds of evidence, if you've heard the lecture or interview, where people report things. Let's say they're in an operating room and there's no windows, and they have a cardiac arrest. There's different species of cardiac arrest, but if you have a cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, that's what cardiac arrest means. In one experiment, 14.5 seconds later, the brain stops operating. So at the 30-second mark, for sure, somebody could measurably, as far as we know from the machines, you have to qualify that, flat brain, flat heart. And they sometimes will report events from quite a ways away, 6 floors away, where their family is sitting in a waiting room during the surgery, or 2 miles away in their home. They'll report something that happened. The longest one that I know of is a case where a man made a report where he was measurably flat brain, flat heart for quite a while and reported something 1,250 miles away in his home. Now, that man was in Milwaukee for surgery, and he lived in Florida. So he reported events, drew a picture of what he saw, kept the pictures because he had a house sitter, and he checked out the stories later after the experience. There's a lot of these. Depends on what kind you like. Evidence is a personal thing. If you interview skeptics, some of them will say, I can give you a couple major names of fellow skeptics, for those of you who consider yourselves that. And a couple of them said in a recent study, I want data inside the room. And true, inside a room, there's some give and take, because when you're coming out of something, you might hear something. But it's better for this reason, this reason, this reason. Some people say, no, I want them a mile away. I want something in a police report that I can know happened after you went down, because that's in your record, the police report's in their record. And then there's a third category. That would be near-death experiences in the blind. People who've been blind from birth, and the only time they've ever seen anything, they claim, is during the NDE, and now they can't see again. And then there's two other cases. I'll define them if anybody wants. I would call them Twilight Zone cases, where are really crazy stories, like where a healthy person is caught up into the NDE of the dying person. And they report the data, and they can compare their two testimonies. But maybe it was an attending nurse, it was an attending doctor. And the last one's the most weird one of all, but we can talk about that. It's one of the most highly evidenced ones too. So,
yeah, I think Daniel, Ken was, concerned on any of these about the potential, and I want to talk some more about that maybe later as well, but the potential of collusion or the potential of fraud. Sure. And some examples I'll give you is some that we know turned out to be fraudulent, which, as you've told me before in personal conversation, there's going to be fraud in a lot of things, but it doesn't mean there's not some genuine there as well. But did that kind of answer your question, Ken, the first part of your question?
Yeah. I just want to state for the record that the AWARE project, those two cases where there was somebody who reported seeing something, those two cases, they gave the wrong answers. So there was zero evidence of controlled studies that provided something that was.
Well, there was one where a guy gave right information. It's been written up in a journal article. So just
in the AWARE project, or
sorry,
was that in the AWARE project or another one?
I'd have to go back and check before I just categorically say yes, but I believe it was. At least it came out of the guys who were doing that project, and then later they reported the data. It's a real interesting one, because the guy was measurably, again, one of these, again, we have to say according to machines, but according to machines, flat heart, flat brain, and reported data that was later confirmed.
Yeah, it just seems like there's an enormous appetite for stories that would support the existence of life after death. And so, and there's a lot of books that have come out that James alluded to a couple that maybe were fraudulent. It just seems like where there's a law of supply and demand, there's going to be a demand for this sort of thing. And so there's going to be unscrupulous people that are going to come out and provide stories that seem on the face amazing. I just watched the finale of America's Got Talent, and some of those magicians are really stupendous. It's like, how did they do that? And it's like, well, there must have been collusion, but yet the hosts seem to be surprised themselves, but they had to be colluding with the host somehow. But the last thing I'm going to come to the conclusion of is that there was some supernatural thing going on. First thing I'm going to conclude is that there was some collusion going on. So whether the patient woke up and the nurse and the patient colluded together and later told a story to whoever else later on, that seems more plausible to me than that there was an actual unexplained third, extra dimension going on of some supernatural thing to let that person know of something that couldn't be known through normal eyesight.
Did you have one more follow-up real quick on that?
That was the second question. The third one was, if these NDEs are truly supernatural and supported by an omniscient being, then why should the revelations be limited to banal numeric or familial observations in the vein of petty parlor tricks? Why not go all in and reveal something truly useful, like an effective cure for COVID-19 or cancer?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to me, that would be like a question like that would be probably in the pain and suffering category, right? Why doesn't God just give us an answer to cancer? Why doesn't God leave the directions under somebody's doormat and let them discover cancer?
Yeah,
Whatever
that doesn't require a near-death experience if God wanted to communicate that to us, right?
Yeah, and he could say whatever he wanted to or not. And you know what? On philosophical studies, I'm looking corner of my library right here where I've got a half a shelf on these, all the silence of God type questions. Why doesn't God do this or that? To me, those would belong in that category. So what you would say to the silence of God, matter of fact, I've written a book on it, but what you would say to silence of God comments in general would apply to this in particular. That's like saying, does God have something against us curing cancer? Does God have something against stopping the war between India and China, or the shooting across the border, the American Civil War, whatever? And then people have to guess about what's on God's mind and why doesn't God do certain things, and why isn't God's existence compatible or not compatible with pain and suffering? To me, it would be like more in that category, because it's us guessing what God should have done according to our view. And all we know from history is what we think should be done, or what happens, whatever view you're on, is not always the same thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. I just, I think my more nuanced question would have been not so much why doesn't God give a cure for cancer, but why, in the face of the fact there is no evidence for a cure for cancer, why offer up these little banalities? I mean, why? It's not why he didn't give a cure for cancer. It's why did he give these banal things like 12 digits on a cabinet? That it just seems superfluous.
Does that assume, Ken, that God is sending that experience to every person who's near death? And what I mean is, what if nature is just set up that way? And what if the human body, to give one philosophical answer, what if dualism is true? And when you come close to death in a Platonic sense, you're separated, let's just call it your material and immaterial part. And what happens, happens. What I mean is, I wouldn't say God put that 12-digit number in that lady's hands when he could have given her a cure to cancer. I'm saying she came close to death. And if dualism's right, there was probably some kind of separation there. And this is very prominent in world religions. And what happens to people in that condition just happens to people in that condition. God didn't send anything or do anything, or somebody saying, why this and not that? They're just behaving according to the way nature behaves when you die or come near dying. So I would say to me, maybe this will give you a little bit of insight. I've done a lot of work on the resurrection of Jesus, a lot of work. The resurrection, if it occurred, I think would be a miracle. Now, even David Hume, the famous skeptic, defined a miracle is an act that would be brought about by God or an invisible agent. So if the resurrection occurred and it's a miracle, God would have to be involved. Okay, I don't think near-death experiences by definition are miracles. I don't think they're miracles at all. I don't think God got involved. I think near-death experiences, the ones that seem to be the real thing, are simply what happens when the immaterial portion of the body separates from the material portion. And somebody says, well, I don't believe that. Then they would say, well, then you explain the data. Because I had a debate with a guy it's in print, with a major publication, secular publication, Blackwell, the Blackwell Companion to Mind-Body Dualism. And it's a series of debates, 500 pages. The fellow I debated had 3 doctor's degrees, including a medical degree and including a D.Phil from Oxford, and a professor at Oxford. We were debating these things out in terms of this kind of background. And I think some of the other answers just naturally come in. Again, I don't think it's a miracle. I think it's simply what happens when you come close to dying. I think that God, if you believe in God and creation, I think that's just the way reality is. So.
I'd like to do a little break right now. I got a little video, and I was going to do this earlier, but we kind of got into the heat of things real quickly. I know we have some questions queued up. I'm seeing that, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. But just what are we talking about, NDE, especially if you didn't get to watch the interview, the 50-minute interview that we did ahead of time. I've got a little video clip. This is from NBC News. It's Megyn Kelly's Today. She has a guest on, Sherry Almay. It's a little 3-minute or so clip about NDE, about near-death experience. Let me just run this, and this is kind of what we're talking about. These type of reports, true or false, illusion or collusion, or something real. This is what we're talking about.
So before we had the news of Aretha Franklin's passing, we had planned this show on what happens after we die. And as we mourn the Queen of Soul, it seems a particularly good time to ask, is there something more? Something on the other side? Today's show tries to answer those questions. My first guest, Sherry Almay, was rushed to the hospital after weeks of feeling short of breath. Just 10 minutes after she arrived, she flatlined in her husband's arms. Sherry was dead for 90 minutes, but miraculously came back to life and now has a profound near-death experience to share. Watch. But in April of 2010, Sherry suffered another setback, cardiac arrest.
The doctors were rushed in. They immediately performed CPR. Within the first 5-10 minutes, they were unsuccessful and were ready to call my time of death.
One doctor ordered CPR to continue.
He just turned into a drill sergeant, and he told everybody what to do. They did chest compressions for over 90 minutes, still without success.
She was put on life support, then rushed to New York Presbyterian Columbia Hospital and underwent open-heart surgery.
I knew I was somewhere else. I knew I had died. I would say instantaneously, when I flatlined, I immediately crossed over into this other realm. And I remember my body just floating in like this white space. And I felt as light as a feather. I felt free.
Sherry joins us now. Sherry, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So can we... What is the first memory you have of, your otherworldly experience?
Yeah, it was pretty instantaneous for me. I remember 1 minute being in this world and the next minute being like, I died. I knew immediately. I was in this white space where I felt like I was formless and I felt light as a feather. I felt free. And I remember feeling really free of the burdens of everyday life.
Was there a feeling of panic at all? Like I've died. Oh my God, I've died.
It was more, wow, this is so beautiful.
Really?
Yeah.
You remember that?
Absolutely.
And was it one of those things where you were above the room? Like where were you seeing?
It wasn't like an out-of-body experience. I literally was in a whole other realm. So I was no longer in the physical hospital room. I was completely in another realm. I actually felt connected to my family on the other side, and I felt connected to the heavens. So there was no distinction of, okay, I'm dead and I'm in this other world. It was more, I just gracefully walked through this door and made this beautiful transition into another realm.
Yeah, so that's kind of an example of one. I mean, and you hear it, from Christians, you hear it from Muslims, you hear it from all different kinds of religions.
You hear from atheists.
You hear it from atheists, So what happens, Gary, when somebody has a near-death experience and they see the late Christopher Hitchens talking to them or something? That's
well, one article on my shelf right over there. The title of the essay is "I was an atheist until I died." That was the name of it. I was an atheist until I died. And of course, those of you who are philosophically inclined, the best known case in England, Anthony Flew was the last of four major atheists. And in order, They were Bertrand Russell, J.L. Mackie of Oxford, A.J. Ayer of Oxford, and Antony Flew of Oxford. The other three had died. Tony was the last one living. Well, A.J. Ayer, who was very famous for his positivistic scientific philosophy and his denying any kind of religious truth, as he was nearing death, I've heard different reports on this. He had 1 or 2 near-death experiences. And it's an amazing story. The name of the article is entitled, "What I Saw When I Was Dead." Now think about that. First of all, you're an atheist. You're crossing all these boundaries. You're an atheist. You shouldn't see anything when you're dead. But then again, you're a human being. You shouldn't see anything when you're dead. So what happened? Well, everybody else stands before yellow light, bright lights, white light, yellow light. Philosophers are different, right? A.J. Ayer stood in front of a red light. And this is hilarious. He doesn't want to call the light God. So he says, "I was given to believe that I was standing in front of the sustainer of the universe." You think, yeah, it's okay. His nickname was Freddie. It's like, it's okay, Freddie. You can call him God. You're just telling a story, okay? You're just telling the sustainer of the universe. And there were these 2 creatures in front of him. Yeah, what were those 2 creatures? He said, well, one of them I called space and one of them I called time, and they were arguing with each other. Okay, that's great. Yeah, only a philosopher would see space, time, and a red light. And then he said, he comes back and he said, "I am more open than before to the afterlife. I think it was a veridical experience. I think I was somewhere. It was real." He was really watching his words. And there's a story told, this is told in a Toronto source, that in the last a year, I think, after he died, they said there were stories that he became strangely religious because his wife said, "He was treating me really differently." And for the last year of his life, he reportedly had a bunch of meetings with the famous Jesuit philosopher F.C. Copleston. And Copleston would come over to his home and they would talk. And nobody knows what they talked about because they went out back where nobody could hear them. So it's a pretty fascinating story. But he's an atheist. There's one. What I Saw When I Was Dead. The one I was talking about was a guy named Howard Storm. He was a professor and department head at Northern Kentucky University. He's the one that said he was chased by basically zombies who were trying to tear pieces of his flesh off. He said it was extremely painful. And he yelled out for Jesus. He said, "I'm not religious. I haven't prayed a prayer or sung a hymn since I've been a little tiny kid." And he said, "I couldn't think of anything to say." And finally he screams out Jesus' name and he tells a story of, boom, Jesus is right in front of him. And so for, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, he starts asking Jesus theological questions. And when he came back, he became a Christian. He's the guy that went to seminary and spent the rest of his life as a pastor, just retired. So those are some famous atheist stories. By the way, he was in Paris and his stomach blew up and his stomach acids got into his abdomen. But he said, one thing I found out that weekend, French medical doctors are always at their cottages on the weekends. They couldn't find a surgeon. So he lied there in intensive care for 8 hours with acid pouring into his abdomen. At the last minute, he looked over at his wife and he said, who was also an atheist, he looked over his wife and said, "This is the end. I'm dying. Goodbye." And just when he said that, someone came busting through the door and said, "We found a surgeon. We found a surgeon." And they took him out for surgery. And after that, he needed like 20 more operations to fix things up from all the acid. So that's one of the most, those are some of the most revolutionary type testimonies. And Ayer thought there was some evidence that he was outside his body. And by the way, I know a guy who interviewed him late in life, and he said that Ayer was at least open to, if not believing in the afterlife after that experience. So, yeah, I mean, it cuts across, a lot of times it cuts across lines and it cuts across beliefs and it cuts across religions and it cuts across philosophical positions.
Hey, we've got a lot of people lining up wanting questions, and we are going to get to some Christian questions too. Just be patient, everybody. I see Jackie. I see Bill, I see Gilbert, Brian. But before we get to any others, I wanted to get back to Chris. Chris B is one of our longtime club members as well. He's a former Christian atheist, a good friend. And are you unmuted? Can you come on and ask your question now?
I think so, if y'all hearing me.
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. Yeah, Dr. Habermas, thanks again for joining us and taking questions. I'm enjoying the discussion so far. Kind of setting aside some earlier questions about the provenance of some of these stories, if they're coming from reliable sources. Let's just taking for granted that there's a lot of well-sourced ones out there, or ones that should give us pause. One of the things you said earlier and in the interview was that this is a phenomenon that theists of all stripes, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, Christians, can be allied on, and naturalists are kind of on the outside looking in. I'm just a little unclear as to, since we have a phenomenon that really needs to have more research done on it. Like, it's been phrased as an emerging body of research, but there's still probably a lot of research that could be done on it. So I'm not sure how we got from these experiences, maybe genuine, to it seems like the response is, well, we don't know, because we don't know how they happen. And it seems like the response is, well, we don't know how it happened, but it's definitely a supernatural thing. Like, I don't know. It seems like that's a leap that I don't know how it's justified, as opposed to some unknown, potentially naturalistic phenomenon that could theoretically come up with future research.
Yeah, if that's your question, I think it's a great question. First of all, philosophically, we should never jump from unexplained phenomena to therefore this appears to be a miracle. Because a miracle requires an act of God. An act of God requires there to be a God, or as David Hume said, or an invisible agent. But it requires things like angels, demons, and gods, to be doing this. We can't make those assumptions. So no, you shouldn't be jumping there. But at the same time, yeah, we got a lot of work to do. At the same time, if this book I was holding up was true, that there's something like 10 to 20 million reported cases. That was, by the way, in North America alone. I've heard the numbers as high as 30 million if you include Western Europe with North America. There are a lot of cases, and I have counted when I debated that guy with the 3 doctorate degrees. I did, for that specific dialogue, I put together a compendium. I didn't list these things. I just counted them in my own notes. 300 evidential cases. Some of them are way better than others. Some of them are mild evidence, like what A.J. Ayer thought, the atheist. He thought he had some evidence. I wouldn't even put his in a list because there just wasn't much there that I would count for evidence. He thought it was evidence. He thought he was somewhere. Some of these evidential cases are incredible, where there's 2 and 3 types of corroboration in the same experience, and the person tells it as soon as they come out. In fact, I know a guy who interviewed the nurse who was on the scene when the young lady reported the 12-digit number, and he interviewed one of the 2 nurses who copied down the 12-digit number. So all I'm saying is there are potential ways to do research with the people who were there. And as far as collusion and things like that, you just have to keep studying and see how many cases there are and how many cases could not be explained by collusion. I think that'd be interesting, or at least improbable that it could be explained by collusion. I also am interested in how many atheists convert to Christianity or to another religion after an NDE with no evidence. They're like that woman who was being interviewed there, and everybody's watching, and you can't help but be kind of overtaken by a person who's given a realistic, true, false, whatever. It was a compelling story, no matter what it was. And when you hear an atheist, most of the atheist stories, they don't have evidence. They just know they were somewhere else, know enough to convert to something. Who knows what they converted to, but they convert to different things, to religious views, but without evidence. So there's something about the experience itself that like she kept saying, I just knew I was in another world. In fact, I'll tell you a real quick story. I was teaching this PhD course about a year ago, and there were 3 people in the class from different countries, interestingly enough, one from Haiti, one from Syria. So there are 3 people from different countries, which diversity-wise is pretty interesting. But this one guy was an Indian fella from India. And he was 15 years old, and he fell out of a tree and landed on his head. And he was like 15 feet above the ground. It was quite a fall. And his mom came running out of the house and jerked him up in her arms. And she said, his nickname is Raj. And she said, Raj, don't die, don't die, don't die. And she's screaming and crying. Now, he's a 14-year-old boy, and he's up in the tree. Now, there's no evidence. But this kind of compelling story, he says, Mom, stop it. And he's yelling down 14 feet. Mom, I'm right here. And she's hugging the body. Don't die, don't die, don't die. Mom, I'm fine. Now, when you want the simplest definition of quote unquote another world or another dimension, it's that Raj is there in his, at least in his experience. He's screaming. And there are tens of thousands of these kind of stories where someone's screaming and nobody hears them. Like the patient says, quit beating on my chest. Stop it. I don't want to come back. Leave me alone. And everybody ignores them. So just the fact that they could experience themselves in a world where they can see you and hear your voice, but you can hear them. Call it a dimension, call it a world. And what I'm saying is some of these are convincing even without evidence. But there are dozens and dozens of excellent evidential cases from different perspectives. Like I said, deaf, in the room, out of the room, healthy people who see the experience and report it before they even interview the other guy who is in a coma or something, hasn't come back yet. And then there's some real weird ones. I tell you about the real weird ones, but maybe, James, you want to save that and I'll come back to it. But it's a really odd category, so odd that this guy, Bruce Grayson, the guy that published the 100 articles in medical and psych journals, he did 27 of these in one article as a special case of near-death evidence. And he's a brain specialist, brain sciences psychiatrist, MD. So I'll just stop there and did you have one more follow-up question for us, Chris?
No, I know there's plenty of other questions.
Okay, yeah, we got stacked up here. This is a fascinating topic, and I've got another video if we have chance, a 2-minute video. But let me see if we have time right now to get with Brian. Brian Stokes? Are you available for your question right now?
Yes, sir, I am. Great.
Welcome to the book club.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yeah, my question is, I think I've seen the video of the professor from Northern Kentucky who, I believe he was in Europe at a conference or something, had an NDE experience, and then later, I believe he became a Lutheran pastor after coming out of it. And I was just wondering, do you think that because he had like the repentant state during his NDE, that could possibly, I know we can't go against scripture and everything, but that could possibly lean towards people converting after death?
No, it wouldn't even be in the category of post-death conversion, because just remember what this whole discussion's about. It's about near-death experiences. And, okay, you all know James, and you know James had a heart attack, and let's say right during that, just before he blinks out, he has an experience nobody else has because he's so close. And let's say he's not a Christian, but he sees something that really impresses him, and he comes back and he says, I don't know I'm going to believe yet, but I'm not going to be an atheist anymore. I'm going somewhere else. But we wouldn't call that a post-death conversion because James is still alive. He's alive. They do CPR. He lives. It's called a near-death experience. So I think let me give you another example. Somebody's in a car accident and they see their life flash before them, what's often called an instantaneous judgment, where a bunch of things, and they feel profoundly evil at certain parts because they see some things they pulled, and it's all over in 10 seconds. And and that person gets to be real religious all of a sudden. The point is, all these, they're pre-death conversions. A soldier in a foxhole. There are no atheists in foxholes, we say. Those are experiences that can drive you to religion but nobody would call them post-death.
Gary, I think we really didn't have the time to get to talk about this too much, about how do you even define death. My heart stopped for 5 minutes completely. It was cardiac arrest in 2018. 5 minutes is only enough to cause minor brain damage, probably, but you kind of seemed to me, but it really wasn't death because I was resuscitated. Or how about Lazarus? It was Lazarus' case. It says in the Bible, appointed all men once to die, but is he somebody who died twice? Did I die? Or again, it gets back to this, what's this clinical definition of death? In fact, in the video clip, if I get a chance to show it, in fact, maybe I ought to even do that right now. They talk about the difference between your brain ceasing to work and the cells of your body beginning to die. And that's a process. Let me see if I can do that. That's back to the Megyn Kelly show. They interview a doctor about that. I thought it was fascinating. How do you define, how do we even go about defining death? Let me see if I can get over there to that.
But I really think there's something to that.
Yeah.
The notion of being dead but not dead is confusing to people. And we have a doctor here. His name is Dr. Sam Parnia, a world expert on the science of death and the author of Erasing Death, which sounds like a great idea, Doc.
Of course.
Thank you for being here. So
Pleasure.
how could she be dead but not dead for 90 minutes?
Well, it's a very good question, of course. The reality is that we all have a perception of death. And this goes back millennia, which is essentially that death is a moment. There's a time when you're either alive or you're dead. And the reason we think that is because when the heart stops, you have no more blood flowing into your brain, into your other organs. The brain shuts down immediately. A person becomes lifeless, motionless, and they are dead. Or even if you go back to the French Revolution, if somebody had lost their head, there's no more blood getting into the brain and it shuts. However, what's amazing is that about 50, 60 years ago, we discovered CPR, and we found that actually you can artificially restart the heart or produce a circulation, get blood flowing around the body even after a person has died, and that made our definitions more ambiguous. And what is now even more interesting is that we understand that it's only after a person has died, which makes perfect sense, that the cells inside the body start to undergo their own process of death. So when somebody's heart stops, it's only then that the cells will start to die, and that process takes many hours, possibly days.
How has your outlook on death and life changed as a result of this experience?
I am definitely no longer afraid of death. And that was something that I had feared my entire life.
Again, it gets back to this whole, how do you define it? At what point are you dead? Or it's almost like a Monty Python skit, recently dead. Mostly dead, yeah. But I'm not dead. So anyway, that gets back into those definitions and stuff. I think we do have a question also, if we could go to George Dolek. He's one of our former interns and one of our writers, actually, one of our profiles. He's just written a profile for us about to come out on the Ku Klux Klan and KKK, the cult of racism. So, George, are you available for your question?
Here. Thank you so much, Dr. Habermas, for answering our questions. I'm really puzzled about the people from other religions who have these NDEs and they see their own deities. What do you think of those people? Do you think that they're accessing some kind of objective spiritual reality, or is it just some kind of reflection of what's deep down in their own soul that they're projecting out there? And what should we as Christians make of these sorts of experiences? How do you interpret them? And then quick follow-up question, are you a dualist?
You said you're a dualist?
I was asking you if you were a dualist, because you talked about dualism earlier.
Yes, the short answer is I'm a dualist. I'm a substance dualist. What about that's the one that question I get most from Christians. What about somebody who sees their God? And what often comes from NDEs, I think it comes from not doing deep enough philosophical speculation here, but people think, well, because everybody sees their own one, therefore, yeah, there looks like there's a God, maybe. Looks like there's an afterlife, pretty much for sure. But it looks like all religions get there. And that's just this kind of general thing they get from NDEs, that everybody's going somewhere. And therefore, this general religious idea of you better get your life straightened now rather than then, which call that karma, call it sin, whatever. I don't put much in near-death experiences. Let me divide the experience into, this is very famous in the literature. NDEs, which are this worldly, and NDEs, which are religious, because the person, oftentimes the longer you're quote-unquote nearing death, the deader you are, you often zip away and start having the religious. That's called, in the literature, that's called the transcendental phase. The first one is more of a physical phase. I am far, far, far more interested in the physical phase, because I want to know if you're measurably now, flat brain, flat heart, I want to know how you can know something in a parking lot of the Kmart across the street from the hospital, and you report an accident with a silly driver of a red car that goes to a stop sign and hits the blue car, and it's in the police report, and we know what happened after your cardiac arrest. Okay, so you can do these kind of things. I'm interested in evidential cases to potentially argue for some out-of-body existence. You go, well, yeah, but are you avoiding the rest of them because you're a Christian and you don't want to think about other religions? No, not at all. Here's the problem. The other experiences in another world, they're not evidenced. They don't tell you evidence. And both sides win and lose on this. Those who say, well, there's no evidence here, so that was just your view. We do have data. I can give you an example or two real fast, but we do have data that our experiences are conditioned by our social reality. That's clear. Everybody allows this. For example, the book I was pointing to, At the Hour of Death, with the 600 Indian cases and the 400 Western cases. Western males, or forget males, Western NDEers see slightly more women than men. But Indian NDEers see way more men than women. And they say, well, see, that's the way the culture is. They put down women. Women are second-class citizens. And that's a social thing. Okay, there's some other things. Well, Jesus met me. Well, I saw Shiva. Okay, so somebody sees Shiva, somebody sees Jesus. I'm not going to sit there and go, well, Jesus is real because I saw him. You saw Shiva, you're a loser. You know, that's not going to solve anything. But the point is, there's no data to celebrate this. Now, the way the knife cuts both ways is, earlier, one of our first questions was about hell. You go, well, then what about hell cases? That would make you Christians feel pretty good. Not that people are going to hell, but that your world is your worldview. And I go, yeah, well, I don't have data for hell either. So I'm going to lose hell in the picture. I'm going to lose Shiva. I'm going to lose Jesus. I'm going to lose a Jewish person or a Muslim saying they were with an angel. Could be, could have been, but I have no way of judging. So in this intermediate state where you're heaven bound, I can't tell what you saw. I know it's socially conditioned. I know you're a blank, whatever you are. You're Jewish, you're Christian, you're an atheist, you're whatever, and you're going to interpret your experiences. The minute you have a half hour to reflect on it, you're going to interpret your experiences your own way. I understand. But is there any evidence which way is right? Yeah, no. What about the 20% hell cases? No. And if you want me to be a skeptic for a moment, what if we found out that many of these hell cases are people who were raised in the South? They went to hellfire and brimstone churches. They heard twice a year revival meetings, and they were told that they were going to, Jonathan Edwards, like be dangled over the pit of hell like a loathsome spider on a spider web. If that's what you were taught, you're probably, in all your life, your parents are yelling at you saying you're drinking too much and you're doing too much carousing and you're all this, you're probably down on yourself. And I'm not surprised if you go to hell, you know what I mean, in your thoughts. But I can't tell that. And likewise, when a Hindu says, well, yeah, my deity said I'm going to be back here when my time is over and I'm going to be there for eternity. Wonderful. Good for you. But I have no evidence for that. So I think the heavenly part of it is almost totally unverified. And so all you have are testimonies. Now, when I left Detroit, I'm from Detroit. When I left Detroit, I sold my home to a Muslim lawyer. If I sit around and talk with him, I'd like to hear about his Muslim belief. And whether he's Sunni or whatever he is, I'd like to hear his testimony. He might ask me about mine. Are you a Buddhist or are you Catholic? You know, and he might ask me. But it doesn't count for anything, evidentially. So, to me, here's why I said that. To me, an NDE experience about seeing Shiva, or an NDE experience seeing an angel, or an NDE experience seeing hell, or an NDE experience seeing Jesus are not much more evidential, if at all, than my next door neighbor saying, I'm Muslim, what are you? As also my former house here, I was next door to a Mormon family. This is cute. I was out working in my driveway and the couple just moved in. And their little 4-year-old son came over and I was working on my driveway. And he came up and he said, what's your name? And I said, oh, my name's Gary. What's yours? And he told me his name. And I said, so how do you like it around here? He goes, it's nice. We're Mormons. I said, really? He said, yes, we're Mormons, the one true religion. I said, okay, well, thank you for that. He was 4 years old. Okay, well, thank you. But that's his perception. I expect him to say that. I expect a Christian little kid to say Jesus is the only way to salvation. You know, so to me, those experiences are only testimonies. They don't give you any data. So I'm interested in the parking lot accidents, the things we can see, 12-digit numbers. Here's a real strange one for you folks. In one of the stories, the person had an NDE and they were up above the room, and there are surgical chambers next door to each other. And this fellow said, I wandered through the wall and watched the surgery in the next room, and this guy was having his leg amputated. Well, that's not very nice, but I can imagine what that would look like, from a television program or something. And he said, they cut his leg off, yeah, and they put it in a yellow bag and put it aside. Now, if I were making up that story, I wouldn't say a yellow bag like a garbage bag. I picture it. I would say a black bag because that's what everybody knows that's what garbage bags look like, right? No, it's yellow. Well, you know what? He could have told the doctor that, and the doctor could have walked next door and saw, oh yeah, the leg's right over there in that bag. What color is it? Yellow. Wow, that's cool. So here's another one. A patient got in an argument with their doctor after the surgery, and he said, ma'am, we got data on that. That machine was hooked up. And she said that it was not hooked up. And she said it was hooked up. She said it's not. Go down and check. And he said, fine, I'll be right back. He went down the hall and came back and sheepishly said, yep, I was right. The machine's in the room. You were right. It was unplugged. Now, how did she see that? Up above, looking down, and she knew the machine was unplugged. So there are a lot of these sorts of things, and the this worldly ones interest me far more than the religious ones because I can't back up the religious ones.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for that question, George. I have a question coming in, and I don't know if he's still able to ask. I'll just ask for him. This is a brand new member of our book club that's participating all the way from India. You were mentioning India earlier. So Krishnan is his name, and he's wanting to know this. He's needing some help, Gary. He's looking for some of the literature. He says it's been a long time ago, but someone recorded, he said he thinks about 500 NDEs sometimes back and published a book with those 500. Do you have any idea the author or the title of that book?
Well, the ones I would suggest right off the bat, they weren't NDEs, if it's the one I'm thinking of. They were pre-death visions. Things that they said they saw just before death took them away. And the name of the book is At the Hour of Death. It was published, my guess, within a year or two. Its copyright date is 1960. And the two authors are psychologists, and Carlos Osis, O-S-I-S, and this is a mouthful, but the other author is Erlander Haraldsson, with the double S of the Scandinavian double S. He's from Reykjavik, Iceland, and he's a psychiatrist. So look for Osis and Erlanderson, At the Hour of Death, and they have all kinds of interesting data, like Like, here's some examples. Well, I think this kind of thing is caused by oxygen deprivation. Or I think this thing is caused, but these are called by hallucinations. Well, they had these people medical reports. So they went back and got their medical reports, said no oxygen deprivation here. At the time of the experience, like let's take President Trump today, his oxygen level was 96%, no oxygen deprivation. Okay, well, that solves that. Okay, maybe he was given a drug that was hallucinogenically inclined. Go back, check the records. Nope, he wasn't on any medicine at all at the time. So they have these records, and that's all in those books. And they have Q&A and very interesting charts at the back of the book that lines all these up. However, they're not NDEs. There's a few NDEs in there, but this is pre-NDE, 1960, and it's mostly things they saw. By the way, the Indian experiences were far more frequently negative than the Western experience. That proves nothing because they're not evidential. I think the kind of testimony you have. But by the way, a number of the Indian experiences, they would tell the person, hey, we're going to discharge you from the hospital today. You're doing pretty well. And the person they're shaking. And they come and go, well, what's wrong? I was visited by the angel of death. What? I was visited by the angel of death. What did the angel of death tell you? The angel of death said that I'm going to die before you discharge me. And they came back in 2 hours before discharge, and the patient was dead in the bed. Or some of the patients were underneath the bed when they came in. And what are you doing down there? What they call takeaway experiences. I was told I was going to be taken away to judgment, and they got out of bed and crawled underneath the bed. Just kind of weird experiences, but for the Western ear. But you can look at the data, you can look at the patient's medical charts, how many of them were on hallucinogenic drugs, how many of them could have reported this or that oxygen deprivation. It's a very interesting book, At the Hour of Death, Ositz and Haroldson.
Yeah. Hey, we got an interesting question from Gilbert. Gilbert, where are you from? Where are you at?
Nigeria, Lagos, Nigeria.
Yes, great. And you have a question for Dr. Habermas?
Yeah, so basically, I just wanted to say, Doctor, thanks so much. I just finished reading your book, The Case for Resurrection, written with Mike together. And for the reason I stayed up this late, this is past 2 a.m. in Nigeria at this time, is that reading through your book, I found it quite interesting how you use near-death experiences to address what naturalism is about science. Everything has to be proven. But it was quite interesting how you use the evidential reports of near-death experiences to argue. You even said, I just quote here, that the challenge provided by NDEs is just an example of numerous indications we might cite that this is most likely not a naturalistic universe. Of course, we've been arguing throughout this book that Jesus' resurrection is another evidence that needs to be answered by naturalists, strong evidence for an afterlife, as well as other pointers mentioned above, challenge naturalism's attempt to explain reality. I found it very interesting because I'm a cancer survivor. I survived cancer in the bone marrow, the kidney, and the liver. And I know that for someone who grew up just going to church out of tradition because my parents went to church, I didn't have any real faith of my own. But I know that going through cancer, spending a year in hospital, going through a bone marrow transplant and all whatnot, and I was a student in Germany in a very naturalistic, very science-driven society. I know that it did heighten my awareness of spiritual reality. And so it's just a personal experience that I have that coming that close to death in terms of cancer, not necessarily having the dramatic near-death experience story, kind of had a great impact in my spiritual awareness. So that's what made me stay up to just listen to you. I just wanted to you to say a bit more along the lines of what you wrote in the book.
Thank you. By the way, I have 3 African PhD students in our PhD story, and one of them is from Nigeria. And
what's his name, please?
They are some of our sharpest students. One of our African students had 5 master's degrees and earned his 2nd doctor's degree with us, and now he's on our faculty. So we're very glad to have him on our faculty.
Oh, that's amazing. Could it be that one of them is Emmanuel Eme? Maybe Emmanuel. Anyway, we could talk about that later. That's fine.
What's his last name?
Oh, Emmanuel Eme. Emmanuel Eme. It could be.
I don't think I know him. I do know one guy from Africa who came over, and he got a PhD at Westminster Seminary, and then he came to Liberty, and he's getting a PhD in Old Testament, and he's a professor of Old Testament here. So he's doing a 2nd PhD. So our African students have done very well here.
Thank you. I'm currently doing a master's, so I read your book under my master's program.
Thank you, and thanks for staying up.
Thanks for joining us, Gilbert. Thanks for being part of the club, brother.
Yeah, it's a joy. Yeah.
I think we have, and I may be skipping over some, I hope not, but I see a question coming in from Parker Stilley. Parker, are you there still? Unmute. Let me just read his question then. He may not be able to talk. If somehow,
I got him, James. I got
okay,
he's unmuted.
Great.
He's unmuted. He has to accept the unmute. There he goes. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So I had a question, Dr. Habermas. Just thank you for being here. So I am a Christian who is generally pretty skeptical whenever I hear of near-death experiences. And so the question I have for you is, if, and hypothetically, all of these instances of near-death experiences were proven or just found to be false somehow, how much do you think this would threaten the message of the gospel? And if so, how? Basically, what I'm getting at is, how necessary is it for a Christian to hold that these near-death experiences are possible?
I don't think it's necessary at all because, by the way, there are about a half dozen major categories of evidence in the life after death category. Now, NDEs, I think, are highly evidenced, but they're not the only evidence. And for those who are familiar with the stuff I've done, of my 40 whatever books, half of them are on the resurrection of Jesus. So I'm going to say, if you give me a choice between NDEs and the resurrection of Jesus, I'm going to take the resurrection of Jesus. So here's a real simple way to answer that question. How would NDEs hurt if we didn't have them? Well, it's a major evidence. But I started studying NDEs in 1972. And before 1972, I just finished my master's degree, and I was going into a PhD program. My dissertation at Michigan State was on the resurrection. So where would I be without near-death experiences? On the resurrection, which is where I was back then, moving to the present. So all evidences are good. I mean, that's like saying, what would we do without intelligent design or fine-tuning or the Kalam cosmological argument? The atheists here will say, well, that's a bunch of bunk. The Christians are going to say, well, that's good, but not all Christians will agree with those arguments. So there's a variety, but I generally say the more evidence is the merrier. So I like NDEs. I think they're very strong. But no, I don't think there'd be any threat on the gospel because almost no Christians even know the best data, let alone use it to present the gospel. So I don't think it would have much effect at all on Christians talking about the gospel.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Parker. I'm kind of with Parker a little bit on that. When we first talked about that number of years ago now in New Orleans, back probably 7 or 8 years ago, I told you my reluctance about even looking into it in depth, studying the issue because of some of the bad experiences I had with it in some of the cases that were disproven. One of the most famous cases that I was first exposed to was a New Ager, Betty Eady, who wrote the book Embraced by the Light. She had a bad situation in the operating room, died, went to heaven, comes back and tells what it's like. So it broaches this kind of area of NDE, which is visiting heaven and coming back and telling what that's like, which has been referred to as a type of an NDE, near-death experience that she had. Well, in some of the research, I think Rich Abanis is the one who wrote a book about it. He discovered that actually there was an earlier version with a lot of different details. So she was Mormon, and then she told a story about seeing the 3 Mormon heavens and had all this Mormon content to it. Then later on, as she embraced New Age spirituality, she rewrote it, changed a lot of the facts. It kind of disagreed with the earlier part of her content. And, we see this bleeding over into the area of Christianity as well. This is a Washington Post story about what they are calling heavenly tourism, which are death experiences or near-death experiences that result in brief visits to heaven. And they talk about the book and movie Heaven is for Real, and Colton Burpo. There's a neurologist.
It's the one right below it, James. That's the second one, which turned out to be the fake one.
Yeah, the bottom one, Alex Malarkey. That's the one I wanted to talk about. Some of my friends, apologists, helped bring this to light here recently. That this story was fraudulent. It's the story of I think 6-year-old boy who dies and goes to heaven. True story, it says. It was a bestseller. I think Tyndale was the publisher of the book, and of course, very, very popular. Well, as he got older, as became a young adult, he tried to get the publisher to stop publishing. He said the story's not true. His father made it up, come to find out. And finally, he had to threaten a lawsuit. This is him, much later, threatening the publisher with a lawsuit if they didn't stop publishing the story. And they ignored him for the longest time. Justin, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of some of the people who were behind getting the story out to make sure that they finally did pull the book out of publication. But these cases that have been disproven, made it to me where I just didn't want to look at it all. And what you told me, and you could reiterate or expand on this idea, is just because there is fraud. And I think Ken talked about this as well, Ken Daniels. What you would say, I think, is that doesn't prove that they're all wrong, and we need to look at the difference between what you would call evidenced cases versus anecdotal cases or stories.
James, I'll just use a real popular one with Christians. If, let's say, you have 6 or 8 cases of ape men, Java man, Peking man, and this one was done from a pig's bone. This one was all done from one jawbone. And this is fake. The fact that in the evolutionary charts you might have, let's just say, a half dozen cases that turn out to be fake, doesn't mean there's no cases. And if they produce, if the quote unquote other side produces data that they say is good data, stands up against what you're doing, and 14 PhD dissertations have been written on this, and it stood all the criticism. We'd have to deal with the real data, not the fake stuff. And I think that's the same thing here. Any number of fake cases can be explained by why do people fake things?
Yeah, Justin Peters was one of the Christian apologists. Justin Peters was one of the ones who was on the forefront of getting Lifeway to try to discontinue the book and talking to the publisher to try to get them to pull it. So what we find is Christians who may have loved the story to be true will fight, as they should, when something's fraudulent, to get it stopped. Yep. As a good scientist would if evolution. I'm sorry, Gary.
Yeah, it doesn't disprove evolution, doesn't disprove near-death. No, I'm just saying in all kinds of evidential cases, we need to look at the best case scenario. In logic, it's a principle. It's called the principle of charity. And the principle of charity is cast your opponent's argument in the strongest possible way it can be made, so that when you refute it, you've refuted the best case, not straw men type cases. And I know you folks, don't like straw men arguments no matter where they're coming from, but that's a principle behind it. We need to have the good cases and see if the best cases can withstand the criticism.
Well, Gary, we're about out of time, and this has been a fascinating book club to me, and I could talk about this forever, but I did want to try to squeeze in at least one more question if I could. Howard Cottingham has got, I think, a question. Can you unmute Howard and ask your question?
Let me find Howard. Okay, Howard is unmuted. He can accept the unmute request. There you go, Howard. You're live.
Hey, Howard. Welcome to the book club.
Thank you. I hope my microphone sounds all right. A full disclosure, I'm a Christian believer. I was not always. In fact, I came to faith in God through great doubt, skepticism. But I think one thing that's overlooked is that supernatural experiences, whether they be out of body, remote viewing, near death, paranormal, are too universal, too timeless throughout history to be ignored. So if one tries to explain them from an atheistic or non-believing or evolutionary, purely naturalist point of view, then that means one thing. But if you look at them from a biblical perspective, the one experience that makes sense to me, and anecdotal experience, I suppose, and much study, is that the supernatural world is real. The beings that inhabit it include angels and fallen angels or demons. And the preponderance of Bible teaching is that these beings have the ability to interact with and do things with human beings. And I've concluded some time ago, not without, and not just from a distance, that demonic beings have the ability to play experiences in a suppressed or unconscious brain. In fact, the whole purpose of the shamanic journey is to get into that kind of position. It's the whole purpose of drugs, meditation, so forth, is to put your brain into the position where you can receive that type of knowledge. Deuteronomy 18 in the Bible explains it. It's kind of hard to explain. To ignore its explanation since it so accurately fits the facts of what's known as familiar spirits. So I think that these events are true. The question is, what's the explanation? I have not yet read of one of these things from an adult Christian believer. I could be wrong about that, but the people who experience these things, including children, in my opinion, are being victimized by a very real and very evil spiritual enemy. And this activity, in fact, if you want to look at it from a reverse point of view, gives credence to the possibility that God is true, that there is a spiritual dimension, because if one is true, then the other must be. So I don't know how much thought on this subject goes to the idea of demonic deception, and that's why I raise it into the room and raise it as a possibility, because that's my conclusion through much study.
I don't know if there's a way of quickly addressing that's packed with a lot of content there. Your question is, but Gary, is it from a Christian perspective? Is it possible that some percentage of these experiences could be, assuming there is a supernatural? Of course, we believe in God. We believe in the supernatural. Could a percentage of this, or the majority of this, be a form of deception, a demonic, spiritual deception, especially when it involves altered states of consciousness, trance states, and other things that makes a person potentially vulnerable to deception? Have you done any study in that area?
Yeah, quite a bit actually. What I haven't given my testimony in this group. It's not important right now, except to say that I went through a long skeptical hike to Christianity. I almost embraced Buddhism after I got my PhD. I always want to say that because some people go, oh yeah, you're probably 15 years old and you're wandering out in the field one day, but it was post-PhD. Yeah, I have done a lot of study on this, and I've done a whole lot of study on the occult prior to this to answer that question. And in general, I would say, here's what I agree with the question up to this extent. Let's just say, even if this perspective of this answer of this question is true, there's a reverse evidence for a spiritual view in general, Christian view specifically, because if this is demonic, something or other, it would evidence a non-naturalistic universe. So if the data are all true, but they are not objectively formulated, they are spiritistically formulated, you still have a divine, a supernatural, idealistic, in philosophical terms, and you still have naturalism's wrong. So you still have a view that would say, if demons, then some spiritual view. But I do think that there are a lot of NDEs that they're incredibly Christian testimonies. I mean, what do you do with Howard Storm's story of becoming a Christian during the NDE? What about the atheist who said, I was an atheist until I became a Christian? He also, I believe, became a pastor. There are profound experiences of people who, it'd be rather strange if Satan, if I'm following the logic here, if Satan were to lead to wholesale conversion and interest in the afterlife. Now, I understand if it's to lead people away, that would be the reason. But there are a lot of cases where Christianity is upheld. And I would also add that there are cases in Scripture of near-death or near-death-like phenomena. So, for example, a pre-death, we talked about the pre-death visions at the hour of death. Well, there's a pre-death vision in Acts chapter 7 where Stephen looks up to heaven and sees Jesus on the right hand of God just before he's stoned. That's a pre-death vision that is not false. Another one would be when Jesus, I think it's a parable, but we can discuss that, in Luke 16, where the rich man of Lazarus, not Lazarus who Jesus' friend, but Lazarus in the story, where he dies and he's carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. You know, if you ever think about that, those of you who are old enough to remember the Chick tracts, when Chick has the drawing of the guy going to heaven, the angel's got his arm around his waist and kind of supermaning him through heaven. I think that's a picture from that parable. The poor man dies and is carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. Very much a near-death sort of sounding thing. Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, said, I had an experience, whether out of the body or in the body, I know not which. He said that twice. He said, I was caught up to the third heaven. I saw things that's unlawful for man to utter. Well, long before the NDE research, I'm talking about a commentary by Merle Unger, a commentary by the Ryrie Study Bible. Before the NDE data, it's been said that Paul tells how long it was, 12 years earlier, that it works out amazingly well with Paul being left for dead outside of Lystra when he was stoned. So, by the way, James, when I started teaching in Montana for the first time in the 70s, I made a comment in class in the 1970s, and I said, don't you all remember when Paul was stoned? And everybody in the class burst out laughing. I said, what's so funny? And it was the drug era, you know, it was the post-60s, and they're talking about Paul being stoned. But we have this case of Paul being stoned outside of Lystra, and his disciples come to bury his body. And a lot of people say the timing is just about right there for the out of body or in the body. So what I'm saying is, if there are near-death-like phenomena in Scripture, those are three cases. If there are near-death-like phenomena, that raises the question, like with so many other things, you have real experiences and you have counterfeit experiences. And of course, one side would want to counterfeit the other side. That's what the biblical picture is about. So I think we've got to pay attention to the heavily evidenced ones, and the ones that have occultic overtones, people have been involved in the occult before they have the NDE. I think we've got to be very open to those too. So I'm open to that part of it. And I would still say, just final comment, that would still go against the naturalistic worldview. So that's hard on that worldview too.
Yeah, I think Howard made that point as well. But that's a fascinating topic. I'd love to talk more about Howard at some point. But let's wrap up this way if we can. Let's see. Clint Loveness, one of our participants here in our book club right now, has had...
I'm sorry, James. Danny Mitchell was before Clint, and then.
Oh, I'm sorry. Clint
had a very quick one that we can wrap up with.
Very quickly then.
But
we're over our time, so we have to kind of make it quick.
Sure, Danny. Real quick. I'm just excited to be here. I watched a zillion of your videos, Gary. So I'm just happy to be in the room. The one of the videos I was watching today, it wasn't yours, but it was something different, kind of along the same lines, but also a little bit different. This was a Satanist turned Catholic, ultra super wizard Satanist, and he was able to astral project his body out of himself, and that's kind of on the same sort of lines. I was wondering if you'd found in all of your research anything that was similar along those lines. And then one of the other things that I think is enjoyable just to hear is some of your stories from the Craig Keener book, Miracles. That was just fantastic. Some of the double-blind studies and things that were done there were just great stories to hear.
Folks, I didn't set this up. I just happen to have a book that's easy for me to grab. If you haven't seen this book, test your skeptical ears on this one. All of you, Christian, non-Christian, who's ever a skeptic. Here's this book that I heard about, first of all, from Lee Strobel. It's called Testing Prayer, Science and Healing. And these are cases of prayer where prayer yields a healing case that could be verified, okay? But here's why I'm bringing this up. It's a very interesting story by a female professor, I believe at University of Indiana, PhD from Harvard. But here's what's interesting about this book. You know who publishes this book? Testing Prayer, Science and Healing. The publisher, Harvard University Press. Okay? Back cover, 2 recommendations. One from a former professor, Harvard Medical School, and the other one, Associate Professor of Psychiatry, Harvard Medical School. So 2 Harvard compliments, Harvard University Press, Harvard grad, all PhDs or MDs, and she's going around to Africa and other places tracking measurable healing. Now this is kind of what Craig Keener does, but Craig knows that a lot of his cases are anecdotal. These are more like tracking with empirical data. So Lee put me onto it, Lee Strobel. Testing Prayer, Candy Gunther Brown. Candy Gunther Brown, Harvard University Press, and 2012. So if any of you are interested in a Keener type story, but more verifiable, check out Candy Gunther Brown in this book from Harvard.
Yeah, thanks so much, and appreciate that, Gary. So does that bring us up to Clint now?
Clint is it. That's the last one.
Okay, Clint, and you were able to get unmuted this time, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah,
Can you guys hear me okay?
Perfect. Yes. Now, Clint has had an experience, apparently. It would be a great way to put the icing on the cake here to tell us in about 2 minutes about an actual NDE that he was participated in. So share that story with us if you could.
Yes, I promised Daniel I'll keep it at 2 minutes. I'm a video editor, so I know how to keep my time frame, but I'll do my best. But anyway, I appreciate what you guys are doing. I'm a huge fan of apologetics, and I work at a Christian video company called Right Now Media, and I'm on their video team. And why I bring that up is my job. So I interview a lot of people, and every now and then I meet somebody who has a near-death experience or has seen an angel. And we don't really tell those stories in case later on, like you guys mentioned, in case it's not true or something like that. But for me personally, I always say, why don't you go ahead and tell that story just for me, because I'm just a huge fan of that topic. But to keep my deadline, I'll share a personal example of my grandmother who had one. Now, we don't have any data to, like prove this experience to be a testimonial story, but I thought it might be a nice way to end up. So my grandfather served in World War II and was not a Christian, but before he died of cancer, he became a Christian, got baptized, and then later on, my grandmother had very serious health conditions, and she she had a near-death experience. And so what she told my mom was she saw the gates of heaven and saw an angel, and she asked the angel if her husband was in heaven and if she could see him or wave at him, and the angel said yes. And so she saw my grandfather in heaven and was able to wave at him, and he waved at her, and the angel said, "It's not time yet. You have to go back." And when she came back at the hospital, she told my mom this experience, and my mom said that my grandmother was not on medication or anything like that and was just about getting ready to die. But my grandmother shook my mom and said her name, Linda, you don't know how important it is. You don't know how important it is. Always be thankful. Thank God for everything. And she also said some other details, that the colors were so rich, just there even were more colors than we have in this life. And the music was so beautiful, so beautiful. And so that was the experience my grandmother told me. And then 3 more seconds, we had another family member who had a near-death experience. And when she came back, she shook her husband, or her husband said, come back, come back. And she came back. This is a different lady. And she said, don't ever do that again, meaning she didn't want to come back. So those were just two stories I wanted to share. And I was just going to thank Dr. Habermas, and boy, I wish you would make a documentary. Maybe you and Trouble team up to do the case for near-death experiences. I think that'll be something I'll pitch at you, and maybe that was that documentary you told us about. But thank you for speaking to this group here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Clint, for sharing that. We do appreciate that. Dr. Habermas, thank you so much for taking this, being so generous with your time, addressing our questions, sharing your perspective on this. And I want to thank everybody that attended. We've had, I think, 66, 67, something like that at the top, and almost all of them stayed with us the whole time. Listen, thanks so much for being part of the club. Your behavior was great. We didn't have any of argumentation or bashing or anything like that, which online forums just give themselves over so easily. And you guys, whether you were Christian or atheist, you guys were above that, and I really, really appreciate it. So this is what the club's all about. It's about a respectful dialogue. I'm very much looking forward to coming back next month. And again, it's just a reminder, we're going to be having Seth Andrews, the Thinking Atheist, and then followed by, in December, Frank Turek. So be watching on our Facebook page for more information on that. Thanks so much for being here with us, Dr. Habermas. Thank you, club. And until next month, let's try to continue in the spirit of what we've accomplished so far. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Dr. Habermas.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Habermas.